was no evidence that Mr. Noriega was involved in drugs, no hard evidence until we indicted him.
Does the NSA collect any type of data at all on millions or hundreds of millions of Americans?
No, sir.
It does not.
Not wittingly.
Have we ever tried to meddle in other countries' elections?
Oh, probably, but it was for the good of the system.
Oh, we don't mess around other people's elections, Joe?
Hello, welcome to another episode of the Rackets Podcast. The last few episodes have focused on the immense crime wave that's going on throughout Southeast Asia. That's still going to be a focus here with this episode, but what I'm really going to talk about is how many of the most notorious criminals in this area are also linked with the Chinese government. And what I mean by linked, essentially acting as spies or informants with their intelligence agencies. This is a topic that you see, I'm not really picking on China. In fact, if you look at most of my work, I touch upon this topic quite a bit, and I'm always pointing at the United States. So if you look at the drug war, for example, many of the top, most prolific, notorious drug lords in the world have often been associated with the CIA. And it's not essentially by design. It's just that a lot of times these criminals, they serve a purpose. A lot of times they're associated with a rebel government, or again, they can do a lot of different furtive or operations for you. And again, it's not just drug traffickers. The name Jeffrey Epstein was in the news quite a bit, 3 or 4 years ago, and most certainly was an asset of the U.S. and Israeli intelligence apparatus. They're not an actual agent, but many times criminals are acting as informants. Again, because a lot of times they can get access to powerful business people, powerful government officials, and in the end, this government has leverage over that person. They can throw them in jail or go work for the agencies. Something the United States does. Really, in my opinion, all of the major governments in the world do this. You see it, say, with hackers. Okay, if you're a great hacker, once they catch you, well, guess what? You got to go work for the government now. So in many cases, criminals are working for these powerful governments. If you go to my website, you'll see stories, about terrorists who were, involved in trying to overthrow the Castro regime there in Cuba, but they were on the CIA's payroll. You can see examples of, one of the biggest drug traffickers in Iran almost certainly is associated with the Iranian government. There's sort of a quid pro quo. You get freedom, but you work for us. That drug trafficker is alleged to have committed all kinds of political assassinations for the Iranian government. I can go on and on and on. And it again dovetails back to the subject of what I've covered on the last 2 episodes, primarily Myanmar. So in Myanmar, you have what are called these border guard forces groups. So those were rebel groups that were trying to overthrow the government, that essentially the government said, okay, if you'll come, be neutral or even, positive towards us, we will allow all of the criminal activity in your area to go unpunished, no accountability. And that is part of why Myanmar now is one of the top producers of opium and methamphetamine. So the other thing that I talked about is because, the drug trafficking has gone on forever, right? There's human trafficking has always been an issue as well, but you see a resurgence, and there's been this relatively new form of human trafficking that is pervasive throughout Southeast Asia, primarily in Myanmar, quite a bit in Cambodia, but in several other countries in which there are people being lured into human trafficking. They're getting the promise of some high-paying job with good benefits, etc. Again, they're preying upon people in Southeast Asia and these countries that are, low-income areas, and they're just going to be more susceptible to those types of lies. So in most cases of human trafficking, it's some form of labor. Well, in this form of human trafficking, there are these some people label it as cyber slaves, but they're these scam factories, I guess for the lack of a better term, where these people are forced against their will and they're conducting online scams, trying to get people's money all kinds of different ways with crypto, Ponzi schemes, just a number of these different ways, right? So the person who's pictured here on the screen, that's Zhe Zijing. He is arguably one of the worst offenders. He's really behind a couple of the more notorious cyber slave factories there in Myanmar, another one in Cambodia. And the reason why I'm pointing to him, because there was a very big story. It broke about, I think, late October of this year, and he did an interview with Al Jazeera. And they didn't really go into his actual criminal exploits. I'm assuming that was part of the agreement for the interview. And he made some pretty strong claims. And he claimed that he was actually working as a spy for the Chinese government. So he has a long history with illegal gambling. He was convicted back in 2014. And according to him, because he had these operations outside of China, but they were catering to Chinese clients. And he was in the Philippines at the time, a fugitive, on the run. He was, again, fugitive from the Chinese government. And he was approached by a member of the MSS, that is essentially China's version of the CIA. And the basic approach was, well, you can work for us and make all kinds of money, or you can go to prison, right? So what's the choice that this already criminal person is going to do? He's going to go work and basically be a prop for the Chinese government, right? So what he's done is he has been able to benefit from a lot of these different Chinese programs. There's what you call essentially the United Front organizations, which kind of like the U.S. State Department, essentially, all these different programs in place to advance the agenda of their country. So he's currently in prison. So according to him, he was approached back in 2016. Well, he was arrested about a year and a half ago while he was in Thailand, and he still is in jail. That's where this interview was conducted. He's fighting extradition from the Chinese government. But again, this guy is responsible for some of the biggest and worst offending human trafficking compounds in Southeast Asia. So you can see here, the person on the left is the person who he accuses of being a Chinese spy, who approached him with that offer. Now, one thing I do want to back up a little bit. Whenever we're talking about stuff like this, like I mentioned the Jeffrey Epstein example, for example, in my opinion, that is as clear as it gets. He was absolutely an operative, an informant for U.S. and Israeli intelligence. There's just all kinds of evidence, but there is still some level of deniability, not plausible deniability, but there is some level of deniability. So I'm going to go in and I'm going to try to show you several different examples like this, where we're looking at different criminals who are operating on behalf of the Chinese government. And there is that quid pro quo relationship. Again, though, I do want to keep in the back of your mind, there's always going to be some degree of deniability with this subject, and you can come to your own conclusions. I'm just trying to show one side here. So what we do know is when I mentioned United Front organizations, one of them being the China Federation of Overseas Chinese Entrepreneurs, that's one of those. They arrange for what's called the Yatai New City Project. That's one of those. It's not entirely dedicated to human trafficking. So when the announcements came out, I think that was around 2017-ish is when that particular project was formed. It's again back there in Myanmar, multi-billion-dollar project. So it had a lot of good positive press associated with it. China's going to bring in some development, billions of dollars of incoming revenue to build tourist attractions, hotels, gambling facilities, etc., bring in positive revenue, right? But what's happened time and time again is that a lot of times the developments are really on the lighter side, and in many cases there's just a lot of these human trafficking compounds. And again, it's almost always linked back to Chinese organized crime, and in some of the examples that I'm going to show you, who certainly have a link with the Chinese government, right? So Zhejiang, he actually does have Cambodian citizenship. That's something that you can essentially buy. If you give enough foreign investment, they will give out citizenship. According to him, the MSS did arrange for that, did make that happen. But this guy, again, while he was a fugitive, again, who is had an arrest warrant out there, yet meanwhile keeps traveling back to China. He's publicly praised by all of these different organizations, actually featured in advertisements for the Belt and Road Initiative. And again, this is all while he still has an arrest warrant. So you got to read between the lines on that one. Obviously, some sort of a deal, some sort of an arrangement was made where he could not only come back into the country, but he's benefiting from this. He's involved in these multi-billion-dollar deals, these massive developments, right? So in my opinion, that is very obvious that yes, I do believe the accusations in part that he's making is that, so also part of his story is that essentially he got too big for his britches. He according to him, he gained too much information and sort of became dangerous. I'm not sure exactly why. They've now sought his arrest warrant, but essentially, obviously, they don't feel that he's doing enough of his sort of patriotic duty, right? So what we can see here pictured, that's him to the right. On the left there, that's the leader of one of those border guard forces in the area where that development took place. So you can see that's a picture of the billboard. It's in the announcement and the buildup and the buzz, because obviously when you're putting these projects together, you're not going to announce that this is going to be a human trafficking compound. There's no hint of that publicly, when this goes on. It's just going to talk about all of the billions of dollars in investment that's going into it, right? But now that he is behind bars, and as this was starting to build up, and as more and more of these reports of people getting trapped against their will started to come out, more people started really digging into the details of, okay, you can see where these places are located, who own these facilities. And again, it comes back to him. You can look at the companies that he owns. But what's of particular interest is that the deals that his company made, part of the construction and the infrastructure, the contracts are going to Chinese state-owned companies. So again, there's just this awful weaving of the two different sides. But yeah, he's signed into business agreements where you've got the Chinese government, you've got the border guard forces of Myanmar, who essentially, again, are basically non-state actors. They're rebel groups that became too powerful for the Myanmar government to hold them down. So the Myanmar government essentially said, if you're not going to rebel against us, it's not a written agreement, but basically you have this unwritten agreement where whatever crime goes on there, like it is just not going to be held accountable. Human trafficking, drugs, sex work, illegal gambling, you name it, you can do practically whatever you want within your borders. Now, the government has started to make some arrests as far as these human trafficking operations, mainly just because it's gotten so many headlines. It's become a major story. There's so much awareness. Again, in Myanmar alone, the United Nations has estimated that roughly there are still 100,000 victims still being held against their will there. So this is a major problem. And again, the people who are protecting it are the Myanmar government, those border guard forces. And again, I don't know that the Chinese government is protecting it. That's sort of a tough line to draw, but this was all created and built in part with Chinese state-owned companies and by Chinese organized crime figures who allegedly are linked to the Chinese intelligence services. And I do believe that connection is there. Again, what I find kind of interesting too, just, with researching this topic, I remember you can see one of the bullet points there of how the military leader there, he literally was holding a public prayer for Zedong once he got arrested. He's sitting there in prison. Again, because it is bringing in tremendous economic positives for the people at the top. All this illicit money is obviously benefiting them, but it was just kind of a crazy moment when I saw that, when they're literally holding a prayer for an unbelievably horrible human being who's just inflicting so much pain right? So I mentioned that most of the human trafficking that he's associated with is located there in Myanmar. There's another one of his projects in Cambodia. He developed one of these projects called Long Bay. Again, another one of these things that's, in the beginning, it was built as real estate and development and tourist attractions, et cetera. Again, multi-billion-dollar project. You can see them there, pictured there with the ribbon cutting once the funding is announced. Again, billions of dollars in development. According to that project, he's no longer associated with it, and then that got cut out. He got cut out of the deal at one point. I'm not sure. It's kind of hard to verify, but what is particularly interesting is the location of where that project was. So that's, again, involved in another one of these really kind of crony capitalist, very corrupt deals involving the government of China and the government of Cambodia. So you'll see it throughout Southeast Asia, a lot of what they call these special economic zones, where essentially a deal is worked out, where usually there's really no income taxes passed, often basically no real government accountability, and often just a lot of organized crime in these types of areas. And it usually starts with some sort of a deal where there's some promise of development and incoming revenues, right? So the particular project where Zhejiang had that development was what's called the Darussakhor Special Economic Zone. And this was when it really got a lot of attention by the U.S. government, some of it fairly, some of it a little bit unfairly. I'm going to kind of go into why, right? So we got to think about this, right? So it's this vast plot of land that China acquired for literally $1 million. We're talking 138 square miles. A whole lot of that land was in a national park area, right? So right there, the first thing that just jumps out at you is there's obviously some form of bribery going on when you're acquiring that much land for $1 million. It's just somebody's pocket got filled up, and it's obviously a very high-level official in Cambodia. If you look at Cambodia's record, with the dictatorship there, that family has made, and all of his, very, very close allies have just made a ton of money and just unbelievably corrupt deals. But yeah, they're able to sign a 99-year lease on the land. One thing in particular that you will find, this is not the only example, there are several examples in Cambodia when the government wants some sort of project or something in place, they will absolutely steal that land. They will use military force to make it happen. And reportedly over 1,000 families that were literally uprooted from their homes bulldozed, again, land taken by the Cambodian government with the promise that, okay, well, you're going to get compensation for this land, and it never happens. I shouldn't say it never happens, but rarely happens. And this is a very common story in Cambodian history, right? So again, Chinese governments, state-owned companies come in there and they develop the land, and it again really sort of get a lot of attention. Some of it undue, some of it a little hypocritical. But the Center for Advanced Defense Studies, that came out with this report saying that the area could be used by the Chinese military, right? So they're pointing to there's this deepwater seaport and international airport. That was back in 2018. Started to raise some eyebrows and got a little bit of public criticism from the U.S. government. But at the same time, this is a U.S. government that has, I think, over 800 foreign military bases throughout the world. So it is, in my opinion, very hypocritical when they would, issue that type of criticism that this could hypothetically be used as a military option. I'm not exactly thrilled with the idea of China, building more, military bases throughout the world. But again, I would say that when it's coming from the U.S. State Department, these types of criticisms, it's just all bunk, right? I read a report last year, a U.S. military report again saying that, hey, they've looked at you can look at satellite images, and there's nothing to suggest that this has been converted into, a military base. But Again, there was actually, there was a Cambodian official that early on that did mention that, yes, we could convert this into a military asset. Now, they were speaking from the perspective that this could be turned into sort of a Cambodian military asset and not really a Chinese asset. But nonetheless, the point is that it's all hypothetical, right? To loop back to the earlier point, we're pointing out that the location by this Chinese organized crime figure, who certainly seems to have links with the Chinese intelligence apparatus, is able to set up a project like this where human trafficking is rampant, and it happens to be in the own special economic zone. Where I want to transition. When that Al Jazeera story came out, he made some very public remarks. And on the surface level, if you just saw the headlines, it would probably sound like, oh, that doesn't sound truthful, right? But when you start to dig into the details, it ties into a really big story. So who I've got pictured there, it's a woman who goes by the name of Alice Guo. I'm phrasing it that way because she was the mayor of a city in the Philippines there. And this is a major national story there in the Philippines right now. She has been she's been the subject of a highly televised senatorial investigation where she is suspected of being a Chinese spy. And this ties back to Zhejiang because he's openly claimed that she is. He actually produced the name of who he claimed that she was. And as that, investigation picked up, they go and they find out, well, geez, her fingerprints happen to match the fingerprints of a Chinese passport holder with the name that he provided. So again, Zhejiang was arrested in October, but earlier this year, there was another one of these massive human trafficking compounds that was arrested in March of this year. It freed over 800 victims. And it was, again, what appeared to be sort of a gambling facility. It has the front of being a legal gambling facility there, when in fact it was really just a human trafficking scam center. And it happened to be on a property that she owns. And there was a raid a year earlier. All that seemed to happen was that the company that was renting the space changed names. So once again, there's another one of these really massive human trafficking centers. And this one, I think, is a little less conclusive, but it sure looks to be something to this, a lot of smoke to it, I guess we'll say. There's some smoke to this one, where this suspected Chinese spy is tied to a human trafficking center there. And when the investigators started to dig into it, she actually she was charged with the crime and actually fled to Indonesia. She was arrested in Indonesia, extradited back, and again, like I said, she is currently in the middle of this Senate investigation that has, pretty much just so many Filipinos watching the evening news and just seeing the progress with this story, and understandably so. Could you imagine that if you were in the Philippines and there's this local mayor who turns out to be a Chinese spy? Like it's just, it's really unbelievable, right? So again, I've just given a couple examples, right? But I kind of want to talk a little bit more about sort of the history. Again, we keep talking about how in many cases, the government will sort of reach these quid pro quo agreements with organized crime because both sides can get something out of it. The criminals get some level of latitude, and the government gets some level of, we can say, enforcement, intelligence. There's just a lot of means that organized crime can provide for a corrupt government, right? So Deng Xiaoping, he was the leader after Mao, and he was that first Chinese leader who really essentially started to bring China towards a little bit more of the modern version of what you see today. And back in 1984, he openly said that, Hong Kong has these triads, and in many cases, they're not all bad guys. In many of them, they can be patriotic. We can have them on our side. In other words, he was actually public about this. And in part, this has to do with the fact that China was trying to get Hong Kong back from the British. So, in the build up to that, these triads had a lot of power there in Hong Kong, and they could make that agreement go sideways, they have some level of power, right? So there was a story. It wasn't a major international story, but it's out there. And again, the truth is out there. It's just not very easy to find. Back in 1993, one of the most powerful triad leaders from Hong Kong, he made an official visit to the mainland there, met with one of the top law enforcement officials. This was all publicized. And again, he was questioned about it by the media afterwards. And he said that, we are willing to work with triads if they're patriotic or quote patriotic and concerned with the stability and prosperity of Hong Kong. And he gave examples. I've read about other examples like this where, a foreign official, I mean, a Chinese official, when they go to travel, where they will essentially use triads as their security officials to protect them when they're going and traveling around the world. And again, given these examples. And back in 1997, that is when Hong Kong became what's called a special administrative region. So it's essentially like a territory of China. For over 150 years was ruled by the British. And then again, there was just a lot of back and forth as far as these negotiations. And one official openly has stated that he helped to arrange this, that there was this meeting between the Chinese government and the triads to find some level of a truce where both sides can agree to some level of cooperation, right? So you're going to see a whole lot of, I would say, if you look at the history of Hong Kong, you're going to see a whole lot of political unrest. And I don't want to pretend that the triads are always the enforcers or anything like that, but you have to think about this for a second. Again, if you don't really believe, even though I'm giving you right there exact examples where the Chinese government has acknowledged that they do have some form of relationship with these crime groups, you just have to think about it logically. Like, why in the world would they do some of the things that they do unless there is something in it for them, right? So this is one of the examples I really like to point to. Back in 2014, there were just widespread protests, like tens of thousands, maybe more than that, in what was called the Umbrella Movement. So this was, which is labeled a pro-democracy movement, because the Chinese government, basically, Hong Kong wanted to have more autonomy as far as their government. And they said, okay, we will allow elections in a few years, but only with the candidates that are approved by China. So obviously, if you were living in Hong Kong, you probably wouldn't appreciate that ruling. And again, it led to widespread protests. And these were really vigorously defended by the Hong Kong officials. I mean, violently. Again, it was called the Umbrella Movement because, in part, because there's just so much tear gas and the pepper spray that they were using. So they literally were often holding up umbrellas. So I want to pause there for 1 second because, again, we see so much of this is not just a one-time thing. And really, one of the leaders who's pushing for this type of protest is a guy named Jimmy Lai. He is currently on trial in Hong Kong right now, being charged with a whole type of I don't know if it's espionage. I don't know the exact terms that we want to go the exact charge, but essentially for charges of instigating riots, outside influence. And when you look at his background, he absolutely has a ton of ties to the U.S. intelligence apparatus. Just all kinds of background. It's very clear. So I think it just kind of gets into one of those, I would say, complicated moments where you can have, in my opinion, it's genuine protest, but there's also someone sort of pulling the strings behind there. And the CIA absolutely has been involved in that. So there's just both sides can be really unhappy at all of the different, influence peddling that's going on, right? So but just back to the subject of the protests at the time, there was, at least one instance where I can find where it wasn't just the police, who were beating and abusing these protesters. There were instances where some of the people who were doing these beatings were triads, right? So the reason why I point to it is, again, we just have to think about this logically. Like, why in the world, if you're some form of an organized crime figure, your instinct is to make money from drugs, gambling, whatever, right? Like, why in the world would you be going out there and beating up protesters who just want to have the ability to vote? Well, to me, in my opinion, the conclusion is obvious. It's because you're getting paid by that government to repress those protesters. You're muscle for hire. And again, there seems to be a whole lot of examples to indicate that. Also, the 2019 protests, we see a similar thing, right? This one was better publicized. So there was just a bunch of these guys all clad in white t-shirts and they have these metal pipes and they're going out there and just beating people. It's really horrible footage. So 45 people injured. And the same thing, you can see like one of the very pro-Beijing politicians, he's going out there and shaking their hands afterwards. But afterwards, news reports started to come out that it turns out that quite a few of these people, that this was arranged by triads there, by the 14K triad, by the Wo triad, that they were the ones who were doing these beatings. And again, we just have to think about, like, why is a gangster so against? Oh, I'm sorry, this one actually wasn't about democracy. This is even more so, just completely counter to a criminal's prerogative. So in 2019, there was a bill that was pushed by Beijing to make it much easier to extradite criminals from Hong Kong to the mainland. So, I mean, it's just completely against your own interests, but yet the people who are beating and repressing those protesters are actually the criminals. And in my mind, the only obvious conclusion there is that, again, they're doing it because they're getting paid, because there is some quid pro quo relationship. So that's, and obviously there's more to it. I wanted to be fairly concise with this topic, as concise as I can be, right? So, that's Hong Kong, right? So Taiwan, we touched upon and a couple of those prior episodes when we were talking about the drug war in Myanmar. So, when Mao took over, Chiang Kai-shek and the KMT, quite a few of them, they retreated into Myanmar, and that's where a whole lot of, when they refer to the golden triangle of drugs there, like that's where a lot of that started. And many of those people were CIA assets and on the payroll, and the CIA helped them in a number of different ways. But the vast majority of the KMT, they fled to Taiwan and they took over the country. And for decades, there was just a level of repression and sort of again, a quid pro quo between the triads there, where they fled the mainland because, in part, Mao really wasn't handling things like that. We actually really did crack down on organized crime, but they were able to flourish in Taiwan, for decades. And it's just been this sort of back and forth relationship as far as cooperation between the government and the triads there. I think a real turning point happened in 1978. So that is when the U.S. sort of gave a little less support, and they started to develop relations with China. So they ended the formal recognition of Taiwan, and then it does still remain in place, even though the U.S. is still a strong ally. When you look at the current news, you can definitely see a lot of instigation there from the United States and protection of Taiwan. But that was kind of a turning point, right? So when they lost that formal recognition, U.S. military bases there shut down, briefly. So who does the Taiwan government turn to? They turn even more to the triads. And this is just but if you really want to illustrate the point, I want to point to the example in 1984 of a U.S. journalist out of California. I can't remember where. But a California journalist, Henry Liu, he was murdered. He had written a number of stories that were unflattering to the KMT government there in Taiwan. And the KMT's, their intelligence bureau, they literally ordered a hit, and they had the Bamboo Union Triad, commit this murder. They committed it right here on U.S. soil. And, journalists, again, just murdered just for pointing out the truth. But again, we'll get another one of these examples. This isn't mainly in China in this example. This is Taiwan, but just to kind of, again, illustrate that point. But yeah, murdered on U.S. soil for just pointing out the corruption within Taiwan, right? So The Bamboo Union, again, and they still are. I think, arguably the most powerful triad there in Taiwan. But I want to point to it's just sort of, again, this sort of ebb and flow as far as that relationship there. So in '84, Liu is murdered. A year later, one of their leaders, which will refer to him by his nickname as White Wolf, he was in the United States. He got convicted for drug trafficking, kidnapping, extortion. He was sentenced to 10 years in prison. He served 6 and then eventually returned to Taiwan. Again, he's one of the top leaders of this powerful organized crime organization. So what do you think he's doing? He goes back to what he was doing before. And not, he's in Taiwan for not that long, and then eventually he is facing murder charges. So he flees actually to mainland China, and he stays there for years. So obviously, just like what we talked about, right? The Chinese government now has leverage over this very high level official in an organized crime unit there. So what do? They use that leverage, for their own gain. So White Wolf, he ends up, developing these ties with, these different CCP officials, right? And basically the Bamboo Union went from very pro-KMT, the Taiwan government, to then the flip side of that, to basically being a very strong advocate for the Chinese government, right? So he spent years in mainland China, even though the organization there is primarily in Taiwan, and actually he founds a political party in Taiwan that is all about reuniting Taiwan and putting Taiwan under the direction of China, right? So it's, again, all of this is just completely contradictory to what a normal organized crime figure would do, but that's what he's doing. And again, in my opinion, and there's just, to try to be brief, there's a lot of evidence to suggest that he's absolutely in the pocket of the CCP, right? So he does eventually return back to Taiwan. He does so in 2014, and he's just essentially just been an agent for the Chinese government. So just like we talked before there in the different spots there in Hong Kong. But yeah, there's what's called the Sunflower Movement protests. It's really sort of an anti-corruption protest, and really just working as essentially enforcement there for the Chinese government. He's done several interviews and been, pretty openly just saying that, yeah, I meet with these Chinese officials. I all the time, like I have a very close relationship with them. And why would the Chinese government have such a close relationship with an organized crime figure unless he's doing things that help to advance their agenda? There's just so many examples, like what he's done there. And back in 2019, there were just a number of activists that they were from Hong Kong traveling to Taiwan. Those particular activists, by the way, I do think have some level of connection to the U.S. government. And guess what happens when they travel to the airport there in Taiwan? They're met by triad figures who physically assault them. The Taiwan government actually raided his political office, looking for evidence of funding from the Chinese government. And the guy's just been very flagrant about it. There were laws against that type of activity. And he was once quoted because some of the lawmakers there in Taiwan wanted him to be arrested. And he just openly said, "I'm not afraid because my country is China." I'm sorry, quote, "because my country is China. I am on the Chinese Communist Party side. So these Taiwanese laws cannot apply to me." And when you just look at it, there's all types of reports that he's essentially acting as an agent for them. He's got a number of businesses, one of which are travel agencies. So allegedly, creating different travel documents to help Chinese spies come onto the island. It's again, there's just a lot of evidence connecting them, connecting this big figure there with the Chinese government. So I want to go to another one of these Chinese territories, and that's Macau. right? So it's really small area, roughly 12 miles, but this very small area has a whole lot of corruption there, a whole lot of money laundering going on there. And I just kind of want to really dig in on this topic as well. So just to kind of give you an idea of the size and the scale, you picture Las Vegas. Well, the revenue in Macau, I think for last year was roughly gambling revenue. I apologize, was 22 billion last year in Macau, and that's only through 61 casinos, as opposed to the entire state of Nevada, which has 439 casinos. So roughly, 4 times the casinos with roughly a little less than half of the revenue, right? So as you know, there's definitely some high rollers who step into Las Vegas and Nevada casinos. Well, guess what? That just pales in comparison to the big whales that are betting there in Macau. So the reason I brought that up, there's, if you're super rich, got no problem with you betting your money, right? But what we have to understand is that really there's just a massive black market. So in China, gambling on the mainland is illegal, right? But you can go into one of its territories, Macau. The problem is it's illegal to really do this as a big whale, right? Because there is a $50,000 annual limit of what you can transfer out of the country, right? So we got, you do the math. If there's $22 billion a year being bet there, that they're not doing that with $50,000 increments, right? There's just this unbelievable black market demand for loan sharks, right? So who dominates that black market there in Macau? Those are the triads, right? So they'll operate what they call junket operations. So essentially, these people will, if you're some, big corrupt official, whatever, if you got a whole lot of money, they're the people who arrange for you to be able to get the money back and forth. Essentially, what they're doing is when you're in Macau, they're issuing you loans. They collect the loans back there in mainland China, right? So it's essentially it's a loan sharking operation. So, and it's also a money laundering operation, right? So you get to cash out those casino chips in a Hong Kong, currency, which, right? We know that the authoritarian nature of the Chinese government, there's a whole lot of very corrupt officials and business figures. They want to get their money out of the Chinese system. They don't want the Chinese government to be able to get their hands on it. If you look at, there's so many of these stories of these Chinese billionaires who disappear for a while. So they usually do come back at some point. They always have some story about how they're so thrilled to be back to serve the Chinese government. So long story short, there's not just a demand for money laundering, but there's just a lot of demand to get the money out of China. And essentially, Macau really is one of those conduits, right? So again, if you can't get any more than $50,000 out of it, it creates an unbelievable black market demand for this loan sharking operation. So there's also, in my opinion, just terrible oversight as far as what's going on there, as far as money laundering. We can throw out names like Pablo Escobar, El Chapo, but the name of Cichilop is arguably, makes those guys look like small fries. When you look at the amount of revenue, his organization, they call it the company, Sam Gore, there's a lot of different names for it, but he's really arguably the most financially successful drug lord in the world. He's in prison now. But I mean, you want to talk about a notorious gambler who's, convicted felon, just high profile drug lord. And he would go to these casinos and reports I've seen reportedly in one night lost $66 million. There's a lot of forms that are supposed to be filled out when there's $66 million in gambling going on, and when it's one of the highest known drug figures in the world. It just I give that as an example just to show you that there's this flourishing market for money laundering right there, and very little accountability, right? So if you don't mind, just want to give you a little bit of history. Maybe I should have reversed order on that one, but little timeline as far as Macau. So for roughly like for hundreds of years, that was a Portuguese territory. And in many ways, it was really a territory that China really, even though it's adjacent to their land, it's essentially a peninsula of China. Really no demand from the Chinese government. They didn't really want it. It was a very low income area, kind of notorious for opium dens, just not really an attractive place, for business and capitalism, right? So for many years, for most of the time, it's always been gambling was legal there, but again, not a whole lot of real big money interest wanted to set up casinos there. And a guy, very much connected with organized crime, though, his name's Stanley Ho. He was the sort of like even though Bugsy Siegel really was, he gets too much credit as far as the development of Las Vegas, but you could kind of call him sort of the Bugsy Siegel of Macau. He was the first to build a luxury brand resort there, casino, back in 1962. So it did start to attract those big whales, the big spenders, right? And even though again he was still decades ahead of his time, but it started to create some of the demand. And again, like I said, that there's just all of that black market demand, those loan sharks. Well, guess what? The triads were very, very active in this area, one of them being the 14K triad. And I'm going to go into their leader here in quite a bit, but that was why I kind of wanted to give you just a little bit of historical background. So a lot of violence there, right? And this is at a time when the Chinese government was trying to make this, one of its territories. So like I said, we're going to get it. It seems to be a lot of evidence that the Chinese government essentially allows a certain level of lawlessness there, because in order to be able to acquire that land back. And yes, in 1992, it became a territory there again. So like I said, for decades, there was just a monopoly on the gambling system, not really a whole lot of real competition as far as the companies running it. And, if you don't know the name Sheldon Adelson, he's passed, but he really became one of the richest men in America. He had the vision back in 2004, when Macau did allow other companies to come in there and to allow competition. He's made, I don't know how many billions of dollars from that decision. He was, a Las Vegas casino owner, but in the hierarchy of things at that time was not really a big fish in Nevada back then. And he had the vision to set up a company over there and what it could do. And I mean, what a decision. Again, made billions and billions of dollars. But the reason why I want to focus on Sheldon Adelson is because when there's this American casino owner in the Macau region there, it starts to develop more and more of these types of possibilities for organized crime and intelligence operations. So I'm gonna just kind of highlight a report here for a second. This was an internal document that eventually got leaked, but basically an investigation by the Sands Macau group. They hired outside investigators. They were talking with high-level Chinese government officials. And I'm just going to kind of, this will be in the show notes, obviously, but definitely some interesting reading. I think that this one single document really kind of gives you a whole lot of vision into the way that, both governments, the Chinese government and the American government, kind of looks into these types of things, the way that influence peddling can happen, the way that intelligence operations can happen, opportunities for corruption, et cetera. So one of the quotes in the report there is, quote, "There's a widely held perception amongst Chinese officials that Sands serves the interests of the U.S. government in Macau." So essentially, they looked at him as sort of an operative of the U.S. government, right? So, one of the things that's mentioned in there is that China declined the U.S. government request for a consulate, fearing the U.S. would become too influential. Essentially, sort of like State Department or U.S. Embassy outposts. Here's this guy who's got the billions of dollars, and again, he can swing a lot of influence on multiple sides of the border, right? So one of the things that they pointed to was that they were, quote, shocked at the accuracy of reports detailing Macau's links to money laundering for North Korea, right? So essentially they're wondering, well, is he reporting back, this information to the US government, right? So they estimated in this report, I think it's probably low, but what do I know? But that they estimated that $2 billion was annually was gambled by Chinese government officials, right? So guess what? There's just all kinds of opportunities there, right? So one of the quotes is that they said Chinese government officials firmly believe that Sands has permitted CIA and FBI agents to operate from within its facilities. These agents apparently monitor mainland government officials who gamble in the casinos. Government bodies have reported evidence of U.S. agents operating from Sands, luring and entrapping mainland government officials involved in gambling to force them to cooperate with U.S. government interests. So again, just sort of a hypothetical, right? So they're claiming that they've seen it, right? And this is all, again, this is a prior report. This was not supposed to be released to the public. Think about it. You're some high-level official. You had a really rough night at the tables. You're betting on credit. And damn it, you lost pretty much your life savings. So, hey, maybe this CIA guy can come over there and get you out of that jam, get you the money you need to pay off the triads who will kill you if you don't pay them. They are vicious criminals. Hey, we can kill two birds with one stone. How about we pay off your gambling debt and all you got to do is spy for us, right? So we can see how, it does open up a lot of opportunities. And they claim in that report that they've been told by officials that they've seen it happen. So you do kind of wonder why China's sort of allowing that to go on. Is it sort of like, like a double agent type of a thing? They just want to see who really is dirty, who will do them wrong. I really don't know, but I do believe there'd be a lot of truth to this. One of the other things I want to point to in here is how they're pointing out it certainly looks like Adelson helped China to host the 2008 Olympics. If you remember, there was some buildup and there was a lot of pushback from a number of different American officials. They're pointing to the human rights record of the Chinese government. There were bills in Congress that they were, to try to block this. Well, guess what? There certainly seemed to have been some back channel communication because Sheldon Adelson, he reached out to, one of the most prominent sponsors of that bill and got him to drop it. So again, the Chinese, you can see how both sides are certainly seem to be fighting it. Here's this guy, he's been able to create beyond generational wealth strictly because of that gambling license in Macau, and would do anything that seems like to be able to keep it, and including some unofficial lobbying, I guess you can call it, which is essentially spying, right? So again, I want to kind of highlight Sheldon Adelson for a second. So yeah, when he died, he was worth, roughly $30 billion. And it's in a relatively quick period of time of when that wealth exploded. It's pretty much almost entirely linked to that decision to open the casino there in Macau. All kinds of dirty dealings with him. So, obviously the Chinese government suspected him of espionage. You can look at it and see where it certainly looked like doing some back channel lobbying there, essentially a FARA violation, foreign, whatever, I forgot how that sounds. But yeah, there's one time where in 2016, his company decided to pay a settlement to the DOJ and the SEC. They did not have to admit to any wrongdoing, but it was all in relation to these $63 million in payments back in China that, when you look at the reporting, certainly does seem to link to Xi Jinping's parents, so just dirty deals, right? Again, both sides seem to be playing this game. But, when you really look into Adelson, on the U.S. side, he's definitely known for a very pro-Israel person. What, used to basically call, the Republican Jewish Coalition was unofficially known as the Adelson primary. entirely, this guy could basically bankroll you and make a candidate out of you. And by the way, if he was not Trump's biggest supporter, he was towards the top. Like this one person can make you a candidate. So yeah, since 2016, he has contributed over $424 million to Trump and just bankrolled a ton of the big players there. He was at one time, I can't remember, very high level official within the Republican Party. So we can just see how, again, this guy who's beholden to keeping the money there from the Chinese government, how that can keep a certain level of influence. But again, just a really powerful individual, and I just kind of figured I would include this bullet point when we're talking about the subject of spying, which Adelson is absolutely a huge Israeli ally. And if you know that name, Jonathan Pollard, he was a convicted Israeli spy. He was selling U.S. Military secrets to the Israeli government. He served roughly 30 years in prison. And upon release, not long after that, he flew back to Israel, and he happened to fly back to Israel on the private jet of Adelson. Right. So another one of those examples I want to point to of where that foreign casino money can essentially become this source of all types of intelligence gathering, right? Steve Wynn, right? So Steve Wynn, several years ago, essentially, I mean, he said, we're primarily a Chinese company. So roughly 75% of Wynn's revenues, it's not from Las Vegas, it's from Macau. And the reason why I want to point to is when you're making that kind of money, you're willing to take some legal risks. When you're beholden to a foreign government like that, you will do different types of things. So he was charged with a FARA violation. So that's the Foreign Agents Registration Act, where essentially you're allowed, anybody is allowed to operate as a lobbyist for a foreign government. It's 100% legal. The problem is that you do have to disclose it. We kind of saw a lot of that stuff with the Trump and the Russiagate stuff. This law really was something that really wasn't in the public vernacular until then, but it's something that's been around for, I think, roughly a century. They just kind of started to get back into the public lexicon quite a bit at that time. But it certainly looks like he committed, and you can go to prison for this. So essentially acting as an unregistered foreign agent. And what I'm talking about is that when he delivered a letter to Donald Trump that was written by a Chinese government official, and they were asking for the deportation of Guo Wengwei. And we could do an entire episode on Wengwei. He is currently in prison for hundreds of millions of dollars in fraud. Basically, this guy was a very high-profile critic of the Chinese government. He's from China. He was very hip to hip with Steve Bannon. But while he was here, was essentially running these sort of Ponzi schemes, just asking for money from his supporters because he wanted to fight the good fight of publicly criticizing the Chinese government, right? Well, meanwhile, he was just stealing the money and keeping it for themselves and living some ridiculous lifestyle. But again, the guy's a pretty good critic. He's pretty effective at criticizing the Chinese government. So the Chinese government wanted him arrested. They sent in officials, kind of blocked, the normal diplomatic means. It's a pretty big story. But at the end of the day, why I really wanted to point to that one is, again, because Wynn was essentially willing to risk going to prison in order to do this. And in the end, the DOJ did drop the charges, and it wasn't saying that he didn't do it. It was just that the statute of limitations had passed, in that charge. So again, just another one of these examples of just how there's just so many of these different opportunities for influence peddling, espionage, etc. Right? So when it comes to the casino industry and organized crime, I mentioned it before. This is the last big example who I wanted to point to for this episode. I'm going to go into more, on the following one. But I mentioned the 14K triad. They've got, estimates of at least 10,000 members, super powerful crime organization. And one of their top leaders is a guy, nicknamed Broken Tooth. So back in the early 90s, there's literally was a film called Casino that basically portrayed his life. And it was released, can't remember, it was either like a month after he was arrested for really high profile crime. So I mentioned it before that the Chinese government was really kind of looking to get the crime down. Macau became a territory there, and they were really trying to get this thing under control. There was a lot of violence between the two most powerful organizations because they wanted to run those casinos. They wanted to have it's not just the loan sharking operations. They sell the drugs there. There's sex trafficking, all kinds of stuff, right? So he was arrested back in 1998. He had literally put a car bomb trying to kill one of the top police officials there. It was unsuccessful in killing him. There's a really cool photo. The guy who they tried to kill, that when he was arrested, it was that same official there for the photo op. But he was sentenced in 1999 to 15 years in prison. He allegedly had an arms factory in Cambodia, roughly 10,000 people under his control, and a $50 million stake in those VIP rooms there in Macau. So really high profile criminal, right? So sentenced to 15 years, he serves 14 years, right? So he gets out in December of 2012. And apparently goes right back into action. This guy's, if not the top leader, but one of the top leaders there in Macau. So there's news reports that come out almost immediately. He is trying to buy more stakes, set up more of these VIP rooms in those Macau casinos, get right back to work, go right back into the loan sharking and organized crime route, right? And guess what? A few years later, we start to see these reports of millions of dollars being embezzled from those VIP rooms. Essentially, if you watch the American version of that movie Casino, as they talked about the skim, which is based upon, loosely based upon real life, these organized crime guys were going in there and stealing the money from the casinos, all under the regulators' eyes. Same thing happening there in real life, right? With Broken Tooth. So I'm just sort of giving you his background just to sort of illustrate. For quite a while in his life, he is living the archetype of an organized crime figure, right? And I sort of like to joke, he makes this patriotic shift, right? So we look at some of those quotes back earlier on the podcast of what I was talking about, where these Chinese officials were saying, absolutely, we'll work with triads as long as they're patriotic. So the guy goes from Mr. Organized Crime figure to suddenly he's just Mr. Patriotic CCP Beijing propaganda, right? So in my opinion, it is pretty obvious what happened. It sure looks like the same type of deal that Zhejiang was talking about, the first person there, where you can either work for us or you can go to prison. And it just, to me, this looks transparent, right? So he was always kind of an underworld figure until roughly about 2017, right? So there were these news stories that you started to see all these different headlines of some of them were pretty funny and stuff like, why is a mafia figure named Broken Tooth setting up a Bitcoin, or I'm sorry, a crypto coin? So one of these ones called Dragon Coins. He was at the signing ceremony it's not an IPO like a stock, they call it the ICO for those crypto coins. It turns out a couple years later, millions of dollars in fraud. Some of the investors were just bilked out of tens of millions of dollars, right? So the CEO of that particular organization claimed that he had nothing to do. He, meaning Broken Tooth, had no affiliation with their company. He just happened to be at the signing ceremony. He's a big name, and that's why he was welcome there. That, again, no affiliation. So again, I don't know that, but it sure seems to fit a profile when a few years later you're seeing multi-millions of dollars of fraud associated with that coin, right? Well, he really jumps on the official patriot level a year later. He establishes the World Hongmen History and Culture Association. So basically the goal is, he says he's going to set up Chinese language schools throughout the world. That term Hongmen is essentially synonymous with the triad, but basically the whole agenda behind his company is, he wants to support China's Belt and Road Initiative. He wants to see Taiwan return to China. He wants the U.S. interference out of Chinese politics. You name it, whatever Beijing government talking point, fit it in there, right? So like this guy just becomes the poster child for the CCP. And once again, I just don't believe that. I view this as sort of like a Jeffrey Epstein example, something like that, where we're talking about where someone has a criminal, has a government has leverage over this criminal, and they have sort of flip sides. So now he's again just this super patriotic guy. I don't believe that this man who served 14 years in prison suddenly jumps out of prison and just can't wait to sing the praises of the government that threw him in prison. It's just it doesn't hold water, right? So let's look at it, right? So he's basically become this poster child for the Chinese government. You can see him pictured there. He's shaking hands with the president of Palau. If you're not familiar with Palau, it's a very small island there. Very much a U.S. ally. There's a U.S. military base there. The United States has a fairly good relationship there, a certain level of influence, and obviously, with that being in China's region, China wants to gain that power back, right? So it certainly looks like he's a surrogate there. So he has this meeting with the president there. They agree, to set up one of these Hongmen special economic zones. We've talked about what happens historically with those special economic zones. Guess what? A couple months later, there's this massive raid where like around 200 different Chinese nationals are arrested in this massive gambling raid that seems to be in an area dominated by Broken Tooth. And I've got a quote here from one of the highest regulators there in Palau, and he said, quote, "There's no way the Broken Tooth was going to come to Palau without the communist Chinese government knowing about it. And either they are turning a blind eye or actually behind the scenes supporting." And I quote, end quote, I 100% agree with this. I just, again, to me, this is obvious. This is transparent. This guy is as hardcore of a gangster as it is. Again, he's got the Casino movie out there from the 90s. He's kind of infamous. A lot of young people really sort of idolize this guy. He's the counterculture figure. And now this guy can't be any more of a Chinese propaganda prop as it gets. So guess what? Like again, these were sort of more these operations. I guess were sort of more the terms escaping me, but not as high level, right? So remember when we were talking about Zhejiang there and these big, multi-billion-dollar developments that were happening. Well, guess what? Broken Tooth, he has his own companies, right? And he developed another one of these there in one of those, he's just part of one of these $18 million development, deals out there in Myanmar, again, in these areas where the border guard forces are essentially the ones who rule the land. So again, crime can run rampant. So in one of these particular deals, again, they were able to secure, you're bundling all these different investors in there and getting $18 billion in investment. Well, he happened to have some very high profile Malaysian government officials, a former deputy minister. So again, this is this criminal guy who's able to, be hip to hip with high level government officials. I'll tell you what, if I was a Chinese intelligence official, I'd sure love to be able to have that guy on my payroll, the kind of information that he can gather. And by the way, the kind of compromise that he can develop, because these particular developments have become havens for human trafficking. So I don't know if if those Malaysian officials knew that that was essentially what was really going to happen, you can see pictured there. That's one of the compounds where, again, people they're lured in there with the promise of a good job, and again, they're held against their will. They're doing these online scams. They essentially have a quota. They have to make all kinds of money for these criminals to get their freedom. They're beaten. Some of them are killed. You hear reports of people jumping out of windows just to kill themselves to end the misery. It is awful stuff. And once again, just like with the earlier example that I gave, these multi-billion-dollar developments, well, guess who's building them? In some of these cases, these are state-owned Chinese companies that are going and building the infrastructure. And again, the crime element run by Chinese organized crime figures who clearly have some level of a tie to the Chinese government. In my opinion, it's a very close tie. Well, he was again responsible for one of the more notorious areas for China for human trafficking there in Myanmar, and again, it seems to be prolific to this day. So that was back in early 2020, right? So, when they announce a deal like that, obviously, like I said, they're not going to tell you that there's going to be human trafficking on it. It's just all this really positive, news releases talk about 18, billions of dollars in development in a really poor country. Like, obviously, who would have anything negative to say about that? So, Broken Tooth is getting all of this great publicity. He's no longer he's this reformed criminal. He's now, just involved in all of these just really positive developments. So guess what? He gets named as an independent non-executive for this technology company in Malaysia, right? If you start to look into NX Technology, they've changed names multiple times, all types of fraud and just all kinds of just really bad allegations. It's a penny stock that's publicly traded there. And Malaysia, last I looked, had roughly about 31 million in capitalization. So, nothing to sneeze at. But again, just kind of odd how this organized crime figure, he gets to be named as, on the chair. But literally within a couple months later, he has resigned, right? And I'm assuming that there's some level that word was going around of what's going to happen, because a week later, Broken Tooth, he is sanctioned by the U.S. Treasury, right? They sanction his three companies, openly call him sort of a figurehead for Belt and Road Initiative. And I mean, I'm going to go into it a second, with those sanctions. What I found kind of funny is the one thing that the Chinese Foreign Ministry spokesperson countered with is that, they countered with the assertion by the U.S. government that Broken Tooth is a member of the Chinese People's Political Consultative Conference, essentially another one of those United Front organizations. So apparently he's not that, but obviously there are a number of these other connections. Again, when we go in here and we look at the accusations made there, there's some pretty strong language there, as far as his level of criminality and essentially his connections to the Chinese government. I would just say that that's a rather weak rebuttal there by the Chinese government. So I'm going to, kind of start to wrap it up here. But again, I just kind of wanted to point out of how he certainly has some level of a connection, but there's also some parallels to that first major example that I was given there. So in China, obviously, he doesn't really seem to have any problem, but other countries where this criminality is happening, they do want to hold him accountable. So in February of 2021, Broken Tooth, he was indicted in Malaysia for over $1 million worth of stock manipulation and fraud. So in that same month, they issue a Interpol red notice. In other words, an international arrest warrant for him. So he is now a very well-known, very high-profile international fugitive as of February 2021. Well, guess what happens? In March of 2021, the Malaysian officials, they also arrest 68 members of Nicky Lowe's organization, so criminal organization. So Nicky Lowe is the vice president of his company, the World Hongmen of History and Culture Association. And the reason that they were arrested is because they were running those same type of scam centers there in Malaysia. So in the same month, guess what? Nicky Lowe, he flees. He's a fugitive as well. So meanwhile, I mean, these are huge, international story, major, national stories there in Malaysia. And guess what? Broken Tooth travels to China, where he is honored by another one of these United Front organizations there. He gets a ceremonial plaque. He's given a title in Beijing while he is an international fugitive, where, directly just him, he's got all types of fraud and manipulation charges, more financial crimes, and the vice president of his company arrested for all types of human trafficking offenses. Again, I got a picture of him there. I'm going to try to wrap things up here for you. But yes, I'm going to have more examples, but to me, I think you can kind of read between the lines. Obviously, there is some level of deniability. In my opinion, again, it is not plausible deniability, but here you can see these examples where we're talking about some of the really just the worst criminals, right? Like, we're not just talking about drugs, we're talking about human trafficking on a level where there's, again, an estimated 100,000 victims. And it's not just the victims of the human trafficking. There's also the victims who they victimize with those scams. I mean, it's just unbelievable. And so much of this, again, points back to the Chinese government. And it sure seems like they're using these people as informants to, assert their agenda. And like I said earlier in the podcast, these aren't the only examples. I'm going to have another episode for you soon to go through that more in depth. I would ask you, I'm assuming that this was a lot of new information for you that really kind of opened your eyes. If you did get value from this podcast, hey, please like it, share it, subscribe, all that good stuff. Promote it, let people know. And yeah, again, I want to thank you for your time, and I look forward to the next episode.
It's a big club, and you ain't in it.
I am concerned that the size of some of these institutions becomes so large that it does become difficult for us to prosecute.
You can have a license. Price is $250,000, plus a monthly payment of 5% of the gross, of all 4 hotels in store. Corleone